This is micro lecture number 3, and in micro lecture number 3 for chapter 8, we're going to look at the vertebral column and the sternum. This isn't going to be as challenging as the skull and the upper and lower skeleton, but this is something that has a lot of different parts, so it's something to still take your time, go to the SLC, go to the library, study with a group or study with a friend so they can point to something and you can come up with the answer. And if you're able to, somebody asks you the question, they give you that prompt, you come up with the answer, you're more likely to do well on the test. So let's get started. Functions, supports the skull and the trunk, allows for their movements, protects the spinal cord, which we'll learn about in AMP, which we'll learn about in a couple of chapters in AMP1. It's going to absorb stress from walking, jumping, and running or lifting, provides attachment for the limbs and all the muscles. You have 33 vertebrae. And in between them, there's going to be intervertebral discs of fibrocartilage, and those discs of fibrocartilage are going to allow cushioning. If you remember back to chapter 5, you know that fibrocartilage is cushioning them. So all of that force that's being pushed down by gravity and more gravity when you are jumping or running, those fibrocartilage allows a lot of protection. You can see that they're going to be cervical vertebrae, thoracic, lumbar, sacrum, and coccyx. So let's see the numbers for each. The cervical is going to be 7. Thoracic is 12. Lumbar is 5. Sacral is 5 fused together. And coccygeal is 4 fused together. So 1 in 20 people might have an extra lumbar or sacral. They might have one less lumbar or sacral. But for the most part, most people are going to have 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 4 fused. Memorize those numbers because these will be ingrained into your mind after this class, and you will need to memorize these for many other things in other parts of AMP1, nursing, or the medical school. Because you have 7 in the neck, you have 12 ribs, so you have 12 thoracic vertebrae. The lumbar are going to be fat and large vertebral bodies because this is where all your weight's going to be putting from your arms, your ribs, and all the organs are going to be pushed down to here. And then your sacrum and the coccyx is where your hip is going to be attached. You have something called a curvature. So when you're born, you should be C-shaped, almost like in the fetal position. That C-shaped is known as the primary curvature because that's the way you were in the womb. You were curved up like that. When you get over, those curvatures change. And the curvature should be, if your head is facing forward, cervical vertebrae almost looks like a C. Not really a C, but it curves out. Thoracic curvature then curves back in, lumbar curves out, and then the sacrum and the coccyx is the pelvic curvature that curves back in. If you're memorizing this for your lab class, I'm not going to make you memorize this in your in the lecture, but cervical, you start with that C, then back in, then back out, and then you always remember the pelvic curvature goes back in. Because if the pelvic curvature did not go back in, this coccyx would be sticking out, you would have a tail. So primary curvature at birth, secondary curvature develops later. This begins by lifting the head when you start to crawl, and the cervical curvature starts to make that C shape. And then it gets even more developed when you start walking upright. Some problems with or abnormalities with the curvatures. Scoliosis is when, instead of it going straight down like that, it curves to the side. So it's almost like a waving little road. So scoliosis is when the spinal cord goes to each side. You might see if this is caught early enough, they might put people in a back brace to start straightening the vertebrae. Hunchback is where you start to have the cervical vertebrae hunch the other way over. So instead of it being that C-shaped of the neck, that starts to go straight or even curve forward, and this is when you get hunchback. You can also have the hunchback in pregnancy where the lumbar curvature is very, very, very exaggerated. So you can have lordosis and kyphosis are two different types of hunchbacks. One's going to be in the cervical region, one's in the lumbar region. And we kind of looked at that. So, okay, let's start getting into things we need to memorize for the vertebrae. So for the vertebrae, you have the vertebral body. The body is where those intervertebral discs, the fibrocartilage, are going to be present. So the vertebral body is right there, and then right in front of it is going to be the vertebral foramen. The vertebral foramen is where the spinal cord is going to be running up and down. Then you're going to have these processes on the side, and because they're on the side, we're going to call those transverse process. You have a process on the back, that's going to be the spinous process. And a good way to kind of memorize this, your spine's on the back, so your spinous process is going to be on the side. Transverse always means side, so transverse processes are always going to be on the side. The area between the transverse process and the body is your pedicle. So that little strip of bone is called the pedicle. And then between the transverse and the spinous process, that's going to be your lamina. So you have two laminas on both sides. One thing to kind of think about with the lamina, if you have any type of hernia in the back where some of this, the nucleus pulpus, starts to bulge into the vertebral foramen, what they can do is they can remove the lamina on both sides, remove the spinous process in something called a lamidectomy, which allows more room for the spinal cord to move around and doesn't cause as much pain. You also have superior articular processes. So the superior articular processes project up from one vertebrae and meets the inferior articular processes from another vertebrae. These superior and inferior articular processes are the articulation point between two vertebrae. If you're in your lab and you're starting to stack these together, you can see how they stack one on top of one another, and you can see how they have these processes, one on top, one on the bottom. And then finally, facets are flat articulate surfaces that are covered with hyaline cartilage. You can't really see them on there, but these are going to be those little facets. If there's hyaline cartilage on them, the hyaline cartilage is going to cushion bone to bone. So you have 23 intervertebral discs. They begin at C2 to C3. The last one's between L5 and sacrum. They have that nucleus pulpus we talked about, and they also have an outer ring of fibrocartilage, and it's that fibrocartilage that helps absorb all the shock. If you have a herniated disc, this means it's ruptured or slipped. This means this pulpus starts to break through that outer ring. It then puts painful pressure on the spinal cord or spinal nerves, and then it either has to be treated with drugs or other type of therapy. Now let's start looking at the individual vertebrae. We're going to start with the cervical, work our way all the way down to the coccyx. So the cervical vertebrae, C1 is the atlas, C2 is the axis. Atlas is very important because it's one. Atlas in Greek mythology holds up the world. And in this case, C1 holds up the skull. It has no vertebral body because it needs to have a large vertebral foramen, because that's where the end of the brainstem is coming before it forms into the spinal cord. C2 is called the axis because the axis has this thing called the dens, and the dens fits into the atlas. There's a transverse ligament that attaches it and allows your head to turn from side to side or gesturing no. And like I said, it projects into the vertebral foramen of the atlas, and it's held together by the transverse ligament. And this is the transverse ligament. There's the dens of the axis that provides an axis of rotation. The atlas is C1 that holds up the skull. Now let's look at the rest of the vertebrae. How do we tell them apart? The cervical vertebrae, every single one has 3 holes. All cervical vertebrae have 2 transverse foramen and 1 vertebral foramen. So 1, 2, 3, very easy. All 7 of them have it. Thoracic vertebrae have a spinous process that's pointed and angled sharply downward. So the spinous process points down. And if you don't think that, feel in your upper back, you don't have these pointing straight back, you have them pointing down. When you look at them in the lab or the library with the bone box, you can see that these, with these transverse processes, they kind of look like ears of a giraffe, and then that looks like the nose of the giraffe. So when you look at it head on, it kind of looks, because the spinous process points down, most of the thoracic vertebrae look like a giraffe. Finally, the 5 lumbar vertebrae, you can always tell them apart. The spinous process is pointing straight back, and it has a very large vertebral body. For the sacrum is also going to have these little transverse lines and these little anterior sacral foramina, which are just holes, but pretty much this is going to be where your hip is going to start to attach. So this is part of the vertebral canal or vertebrae. Then you're going to have the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis attached on the side. Your coccyx usually has 1 to 4, sometimes 5. They're fused together, and this is sometimes called your tailbone. Now finishing up the sternum. The sternum is the breastbone. It's made up of the manubrium, the body, and finally the xiphoid process. If you've ever taken first aid and you've taken CPR, you should know about the xiphoid process. The xiphoid process is very important because this is a little piece of cartilage that sticks down. You might have learned that when you're doing CPR, you find where it comes up to the sternum. You put 2 fingers down, and then you put your palm right on top of the body of the sternum. You do that because you want to be far away from the xiphoid process, because if you're doing chest compressions on the xiphoid process, it can break and puncture a lung, and then the person not only doesn't have their heart beating, they also have a punctured lung. So manubrium, body, xiphoid process. And finishing up with the ribs. So you have 7 true ribs, so 1 through 7. And the definition of a true rib, each rib has its own costal cartilage connecting it to the sternum. A false rib, 8 to 12, lacks independent cartilage or connection to the sternum. The difference between 8 through 12, they all don't have connection to the sternum, but the floating ribs don't have any connection, which means they float. 8, 9, and 10, they all connect to other types of cartilage that attaches then to the sternum, but floating ribs are all going to be on their own and just going to attach to thoracic vertebrae 11 and thoracic vertebrae 12. So some students get this kind of confused, but you can see 1 through 7, it all goes to its own cartilage that attaches it to the sternum. 8, 9, and 10, they all attach to other types of cartilage that then attaches to the cartilage of 7, and then eventually goes back to the rib. And 11 and 12, they have no attachment to the sternum at all. But the definition of true versus false, true attaches directly, false doesn't attach directly, and that whole thing of not attaching directly, that doesn't attach directly, and 8, 9, and 10 also don't attach directly. So don't get confused by false versus floating. Floating are just 2 types of false ribs. And that concludes this micro lecture. Good luck.